Now, in other news, this one's actually still winning in good news. The Supreme Court rules against EPA, limits agencies' authorities to regulate carbon dioxide emissions, and obviously the Greta Thunbergs, the Biden administration, the Democrats, the progressive left, because they're all combined in one kind of loop-de-loop unison. They're losing their minds over this. They're taking to the streets again, just acting insane, which we'll get to our last story of the day of just how insane they're going, because whenever they get insane, they always go to a very specific something, and I'll tell you kind of beforehand, they get to the whole racism aspect of everything. That's where we're going to end up leading here in a moment. But before that, let's get into this Environmental Protection Agency, EPA versus West Virginia. So the Supreme Court ruled in West Virginia v. EPA that the EPA does not have the constitutional authority to regulate carbon dioxide emissions from power plants in order to bring about a transition away from coal energy throughout the country, because it was not specifically granted by the power of Congress. And this is important because lately you've had the Supreme Court within this last week, I would say maybe week and a half, actually going towards what the Constitution says and doesn't say. And sometimes that is going to lead to certain losses on the conservative side, which will be our next story regarding the Remain in Mexico policy. But it says here, quote, the Supreme Court sharply curtails the authority of the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. In a 6-3 ruling, the court sides with conservative states and fossil fuel companies, in adopting a narrow reading of the Clean Air Act. Greta Thunberg's probably screaming, "Don't you dare! I can't believe you, screw you!" Just losing their minds over it. As noted by SCOTUS blog, the central question was whether or not Congress granted the EPA of the Clean Air Act the authority to devise emission caps based on the generation shifting approach that the agency took in the Clean Power Plan. Basically saying, hey, you know what, we're going to pass our regulative authority onto you, and you go and decide and basically create, I don't want to say create law, but basically create regulations and certain things that people would have to abide by when the EPA is not an elective representative body. So basically they're deviating, putting the power towards and giving it to somebody else. Very similar to kind of what we were seeing with the executive branch, Congress, handing over power to the CDC during COVID-19. And everybody's going, well, where the hell? You're not representative of the body. You weren't elected. Why the hell are you telling us what to do? And that's where the problem came into effect here. But again, because the progressive left, the Democrats lack understanding of how government is supposed to work, they just want power, which is always mind-blowing to me that they'll say, oh, well, the Republicans want power. It's all about power. Again, it will get that aspect of power into our last news story of the day regarding racism and holding people back, blah, 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 blah. It's all Republicans' fault. It's all conservatives' fault. Look at them want power. It's mind-blowing because conservatives and Republicans don't want bigger government. We don't want the government to have a lot of power. We want the power to be within the individual, within the people, within Americans, to be able to elect and vote in who they want, that will sit there and adopt their rights, their decisions, and what they want going forward. But again, the Democrats don't want that. They want the federal government to decide everything. But then when the government itself, the big government, meaning, you know, you have the judicial branch here voting on something that goes their way, all of a sudden the government sucks. All of a sudden it's terrible. It's just, they are so wish-washy on everything. It is mind-blowing. And I'll get to the point, again, when we get into our next Supreme Court hearing of the Remain in Mexico policy. SCOTUS blog explained that the dispute began in 2015 with the Obama administration's adoption of the Clean Power Plan, a rule that sought to combat climate change by reducing carbon pollution from power plants. The plan never went into effect. However, several states and private plaintiffs challenged it in federal court, and divided Supreme Court put it on hold in February 2016. Once Donald Trump came into the office, his administration repealed the plan and instituted basically a set of rules known as the ACE rule. And it went down through the circuit courts, blah, blah, blah. And Chief Justice ended up writing the majority opinion and was joined by Justice Clarence Thomas, who's now an Uncle Tom to the Democrats and progressive left. He's no longer black, folks. Somehow he's white. Amy Coney Barrett, Samuel Alito, and Neil Gorsuch. Justices Alina Kagan, Breyer, and Sotomayor dissented, obviously. Again, those three are always in band. They're always in unison. The fact that they would never deviate is just, it's typical. This is what the majority decision opinion stated. It said, capping carbon dioxide emissions at a level that will force a nationwide transition away from the use of coal to generate electricity may be a sensible solution to the crisis of the day, Roberts concluded. But it is not plausible that the Congress gave EPA the authority to adopt on its own such a regulatory scheme in Section 111D. A decision of such magnitude and consequence rests with Congress itself, or an agency acting pursuant to a clear delegation from the representative body, which is what I just said earlier. The judgment of the Court Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuits is reversed, and the cases are remained for further proceedings consistent with this opinion. So again, they're delegating and giving certain duties to a sector of the government, the EPA, that's not elected by the people, and that's where this is a problem. And again, the left just don't understand it. They don't get it. So that was one victory for all of us, because a lot of conservatives and Republicans just don't like the EPA. I mean, hell, I'd say even people that are centrist aren't a big fan of the EPA. So that was a win, but now we got kind of a loss here, folks. And this has to do with immigration, illegal immigration, and also kind of, MAGA people, Trump people, kind of like myself. So Supreme Court hands Biden a victory here, allows to end Remain in Mexico policy. So this one is kind of hard to get and understand. And it is kind of a wonky decision, not in the sense of I necessarily disagree with it. It's just, you could tell the justices were trying to interpret and understand the wording and language of what was written in the law and the acts within itself. So I get where they're coming from here, and it's kind of the fault of those that created the Remain in Mexico policy within itself and the laws that are on the books, because it's just not really clear. So the Supreme Court ruled Thursday in a 5-4 decision that the Biden administration can repeal the Trump administration's Migrant Protection Protocols, commonly known as Remain in Mexico policy, reversing a lower court ruling. Under that policy, migrants seeking entry into the United States basically had to stay in Mexico as they awaited their hearings. The Trump administration, as you know, put in the policy in place so that migrants would not be released into the United States, of which the Biden administration is trying to reverse that because that's what he wants to do. He just wants to release thousands, tens of thousands, maybe even millions at this point. We've heard upwards of 1.5 million people being released into the interior of the United States. That's what he wants. So at issuance of whether the Department of Homeland Security's suspension and subsequent termination of the policy violated federal law was what the Biden administration was looking at, as well as the Supreme Court. That basically requires migrants to be detained, or if they arrive from a contiguous country, basically being sent back. Well, they didn't go with that. You had Roberts citing this, saying that someone applying for admission shall be detained for a proceeding unless they are clearly and beyond a doubt entitled to be admitted. And also says if they are from a contiguous territory like Mexico, the Attorney General may return the alien to that territory as they are awaiting a hearing. You have Texas and Missouri had pointed to this language and arguing that the Remain in Mexico policy was necessary to adhere to this law. Without the ability to detain everyone, the states argued in their lawsuit sending them back would be possible and necessary. So you have this fighting on language. And the court's majority pointed to the language in the law saying that the government, quote, may return migrants to a contiguous territory, noting the, quote, discretionary nature of the wording. Well, all sides agreed that the state's interpretation agreed basically with the states that the lower court ruling that a return is required if a person is not detained that the court disputed. The problem is that the statute does not say anything like that, Roberts wrote. So because the statute and the wording of it doesn't fit kind of what the lower courts were applying, doesn't necessarily fit what Texas and Missouri was saying, then they're going to basically throw it out. And so you have Justice Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan, and Brett Kavanaugh going along with this. Now, here's my issue, not necessarily with the wording and kind of the way Congress went about it. I understand it. If you got a problem with the wording, get it. You can get that fixed later on and figure everything out, blah, blah. But the problem is that you see the lack in linear logic with Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan. And I guess technically Kavanaugh here too. Again, the quote was, the problem is the statute does not say anything like that. This goes back to the Roe v. Wade decision, on which Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan did not want it to be overturned. If you recall in our episode where we did the history of Roe v. Wade, we started off with Griswold v. Connecticut, and we talked about how through the emanations of the Bill of Rights, it created penumbras, shadows, that within those shadows, you can find newly found rights, but according to the justices of the time, those rights have already existed unbeknownst to 176 years of legislatures and framers who never wrote it into the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Somehow it was still there, and that you could find these newly found rights. So even though it didn't say anything like it in terms of a woman's right to abortion, abortion within itself, they applied the zone of privacy or the right to privacy to Roe v. Wade, and that you had a right to ultimately have an abortion. So they found all these newly found rights, right? Doesn't say anything like it. The justices actually acknowledged it of the time, not just in Griswold v. Connecticut, but also Roe v. Wade. The clerks of those that wrote the majority opinion, Black Mum of Roe v. Wade, said that it was bad law, that it actually doesn't say anything like it in there. That you have the same people that didn't want it to be overturned because somehow it says it in there, even though it doesn't. But then here want to get rid of the Remain in Mexico because the statute does not say anything like it. So on one hand, it doesn't say it, but we're going to still go for it. Here it doesn't say it, so we're going to go against it and remove it. Does anybody not see kind of the switch in the maneuvers here and the lack of linear logic that are coming with these justices? I get the language. I understand that. If something doesn't say it, hell, it doesn't say it. That's the problem of those that wrote the damn thing. But, again, this is the stuff they want to push here. This is how it all works, and that's what bugs me. And that's why I like justices like Clarence Thomas that sit there and can go and have linear logic, that have a problem with certain people's thinking. I understand they all get along, but hell, you gotta think, man. He has to be banging his head against the wall with Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan, and now maybe even Kavanaugh. But again, I understand the idea. I know I'm repeating myself, but I get the understanding of the idea that's not there. Now, here's my problem with it all. You're not sending them back. The Biden administration wants them here. There's not enough room for them here, which is why he was basically flying them and planing them all around the United States under the dark of the night. We have footage of that in old episodes. Go check those out. Of security basically going, what the hell is this plane doing here on the tarmac? There's no record of this plane. Who are you? The guy's being suspicious. Literally, it's dark. There's no lights around. The guy says, we don't want news and media around. We don't want cameras around. We got footage of these guys placing these illegal immigrants into vans, into buildings, and then chauffeuring them off to other places in the United States. There's been graphs that a lot of these people, majority of them are heading to Florida, which is pissing off Governor Ron DeSantis. But also the other problem here with this Remain in Mexico policy that basically the liberals had was that the people that were being held in Mexico while trying to wait for their paperwork to be evaluated is there was rapes and all this stuff happening. Basically, all this crime was happening in those camps and the tents along the border that was on the Mexico side. Somehow, and it's going to sound terrible, somehow that's our fault. Somehow somebody else's country is committing all these crimes, but it's our fault. And I'd like to point out that a lot of these people seeking asylum, and it's terrible. I'm not for rape. I'm not for any of that crime, but that's Mexico's problem. Where's the Mexican government on that? Where is the left here? All these feminists and all these people in the LGBT community not rising up and getting pissed at the Mexican government. Why are you getting pissed at our government for sending somebody back while they're trying to meet their asylum or get their paperwork evaluated and all these things? We don't have room for them here. You want to let them into the interior and understand that a lot of them do go to their court dates and all those things, but the vast majority of them do not meet the requirements of asylum and all those things. So where's the leftist progressive getting all pissed off about those that are getting raped and savaged in Mexico? But when they're here, it's fine. It's whatever. It's just, you ask these questions and then what you're going to be called is a racist. You ask any sort of question, you're a bigot. You're a homophobe, all these things. And you're just asking questions. I'm not saying that we shouldn't sit there and try to figure it out of like, okay, well, what can we do about the immigration paperwork? How can we streamline it? How can we make it better? I think that's definitely a conversation that needs to be had. I think a lot of people that try to come into this country the legal way says it sucks and needs to be fixed. But to say that it's always our fault, it's our problem that other people are getting raped and that, well, we should just let them stay here, that we're just going to allow them. This is clearly an incentive for them to pour across the country, make such a demand that we don't have enough room to keep them. So we have to send them other places like arenas around the United States, pay for their hotel fees, pay for their medical. Some of them give birth here. We got to pay for that. We got to pay for their food. We got to pay for their shelter. We got to pay for their clothing. We got to pay for their baby formula. We got to pay for all these things. And nobody's raising eyebrows going, hey, this is probably a problem. You got MS-13 gang members pouring across the border. You got drug cartel pouring across the border. This incentivizes more smuggling and sex trafficking of the border. You have all these things taking place, but the Democrats left don't want to talk about it. Remain in Mexico, effectively gone. So that's what the Supreme Court ruled on. It is a loss for us, but hey, you know what? It's also the problem with those that created it. For lack of language, you should have made it more clear. And again, it says right here, Roberts explained that Congress meant for a return to be mandatory in the event that there was a lack of compliance with the detention requirement. It would have said so in clear language. So because it didn't, we ended up getting screwed on that one. I hope you enjoyed that clip from the Bald Brad Show. If you did, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all our future content.